Welcome, folks.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started in just a minute. Feel free to rename yourself with your name, organization, and pronouns if you would like to do so. We're going to get started in just a moment. We're just admitting folks into the room. Welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. Welcome everyone. We're going to get started in just a moment. Welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. Feel free to rename yourself with your organization and your pronouns if you would like. And we're going to get started. We have a lot of folks joining the call today, so we just want to give folks a chance to enter the room. Welcome, everyone. Okay, we're going to get started, and I'm sure some more folks are going to join us as well. I'm Deirdre Munley. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at JPro. JPro is the organization that is of, by, and for all of us who work in the Jewish communal organizations across our sector, both in the United States and Canada. We are for all of those who work in the Jewish community, including people of all religions, Jews of all ways of being Jewish, people of all backgrounds, and we're so pleased to be offering this program to you today. I'm going to share some technical notes and expectations, and my colleague is going to put these into the chat as well. In terms of setting expectations for our conversation, we know that navigating through polarization can be very difficult to talk about, and we have deeply personal experiences and heightened emotions. As a participant in this program, we ask that you agree to refrain from name calling, speaking in generalizations, and promoting stereotypes. If you do not comply with these guidelines, you will be removed from the session. While the program itself will not promote a particular perspective, our speakers have been invited to share their views in ways that are respectful of our community's diversity. From a technical perspective, the session is being recorded and will be shared to JPro's YouTube channel after today's session concludes. There's closed captioning available. You can activate it or turn it off in the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. If you need any tech help today, please reach out to JPro Help in the chat. Send any questions that you may have for our panelists directly to my colleague, Laura Herman, who will collate them for our Q&A. My colleague is going to place a prompt into the chat, and we encourage you to respond with what sparked you to join us today. And as that is populating in the chat, I just want to share a couple of remarks about what led us to do this program today. In the months since October 7th Hamas terror attack on Israel, the impact on our Jewish workplaces and on each of us working within those organizations has truly been profound. Personal and collective trauma, grief, loss, and anger have triggered a wide array of experiences within workplaces. At times, this has been feelings of unity, and at other times, feelings of fracture and conflict. As JPro has worked with and spoken with professionals at all levels and of all backgrounds, the topic of how to navigate conflict within professional settings has continued to rise up, and in many ways, it hasn't gotten any easier as the Israel-Hamas war has gone on. On a daily basis, a call, a text, or an email can trigger either elation and relief, as with the news of the hostages being rescued this morning, or can cause more grief and loss as casualties continue. The lines between personal and professional are in many ways harder to navigate than ever before. In our time together today, we want to dig deep into how to approach the conflicts that are showing up in so many Jewish workplaces related to October 7th, and what employees at all levels can do to support themselves and their colleagues, and to ensure that the vital work of all of our missions can carry on in these difficult times. As you listen, please keep in mind other programs or supports that JPro can offer to help you continue the conversation, because we'll be asking you to share those at the end of our time together. And I'll also share additional resources that JPro is offering to professionals in navigating this time. I want to thank Amal Palmer for moderating today's conversation. And I also want to thank our wonderful panelists for today, Meredith Bliss, Rabbi Dr. Joshua Layden, Dr. Karen Freeman, Dr. Dietra Reiser. I'm so looking forward to learning from all of you, and I'm sure everyone here is as well. I'm going to turn it over to Gamal.
Thank you. It's so great to be with you, JPro team, as well as these esteemed panelists, and also everybody here who are tuning in from maybe around the world and definitely North America. And I wanted to just start by saying that as a person who works with companies and organizations both within and outside of the Jewish world, that we are now at this stage and phase of what happened on October 7th and all of the impacts post. Understanding that the world is shifting and changing and people are grappling with things in ways, as Deidre said, that they maybe didn't know how to or expected to have to grapple with. And so for panelists, I'd love for you all to just share briefly, why is this topic so important to you? And, and what is your entry point into this conversation? We can start with Dr. Dietra Reiser.
Hi, everyone. It's really wonderful to be with you all. So to me, what is really driving me in this moment is my desire for our community, both Jews and non-Jews, but everyone who's in our community, to lean into relationship and really lean into those shared values that we have, of humanity, of knowing that that people enter into work as our whole selves, and that includes like all of our identities. And what I've noticed in this moment is a fracturing. People are really having a tough time, partially from the trauma that Deirdre talked about when she opened, and part from having difficulty talking across differences and really also standing in the nuance. So my hope is that in this conversation, we can really uncover some ways to be in nuance together, and to lean into our shared values and our relationships.
Meredith, please.
Sure. So similarly to you, Gamal, I work in the Jewish space, in the not, and most of my work is really focused on helping individuals and teams sort of be and do the best that they can be as individuals and as collectives. And in a moment like this, I'm just seeing the sort of the complexity, that nuance that Dietrich just talked about. The fracturing is so intense and so nuanced and so personal that some of the things that in other situations and contexts have worked in the past, like is not true right now, right? I keep finding myself saying this feels hard because it is hard. This feels so complicated because it is that complicated. And so what we do with that as individuals and as teams, as leaders, as humans, when we're trying to show up for ourselves and each other and do great work that sometimes is deeply rooted in this conflict and sometimes isn't. So many of us do work that this isn't necessarily the work on a daily basis. It is just incredibly hard. And I'm seeing that show up in all different ways in all different places all the time.
Thank you. And Karen?
All right, thanks, Kamal. So I think echoing what Dietra and Meredith have already said, but I guess perhaps adding a different dimension. I think October 7th elevated so many latent tensions that had maybe existed for a long time and heightened them in ways that are deeply hard. And I think we're not even yet in a post-trauma. I think we're very much in a present trauma. and operating in present trauma is so challenging, because our emotions are so heightened, because our ability to process difference and when in a moment when we're seeking security and safety, it makes all of the things that existed before just even more difficult. And I think what I've held on to and I think what drew me into this conversation is, how do we remind ourselves of the tools that are already in our toolbox, and how do we lean on those perhaps even, harder than we did in the past, in order to overcome what we're feeling in the present trauma. And because we're not yet past it. I know that even this morning when I woke up with the good news, it reminded me that every day I'm waking up seeking that, maybe just that ounce of good news that will make it feel a little brighter.
Thank you, Doctor. And Joshua, please.
Thanks for including me. So I'll say very personally, I'm a rabbi who lived in Jerusalem for 8 years, and met my spouse actually doing volunteer work on bringing Jews to meet with Palestinians. So and doing that in the post-Second Intifada time period, it felt like it was really important to me that sort of my commitments are about how can the Jewish people be the best versions of themselves. The other commitment that draws me into this conversation today is not wanting Jews to give up on Jews. And I recognize there's a diversity of participation in this, where some of us are Jewish, some of us are Jewish adjacent, some of us work in Jewish. I work in a very Jewish institution that is, and there's a whole range. So I recognize I'm speaking in a particular register. I'll just say, and given what happened on October 7th has illuminated and sort of exacerbated for me sort of a conflict within the nature of Judaism that I'm oftentimes finding myself conflicted around, which is, on one hand, Judaism is this inherited people. We can convert in, you can join, but it's an inherited nature of being a people is that, oh, I care not just about the belief system, but also the actual people that make up the Jews. And on the other hand, it's a religion, and it's a religion with a set of aspirations. And right now, those two elements are in deep existential conflict, and they're in existential conflict inside me, and I imagine in many of us, which is our sense of concern over safety can lead us to a particular set of political and social values, and our concerns over the Jews being having moral aspirations. So there are voices inside the Jewish people that are saying, we need to take care of the Jews and we need to make sure the Jews are safe. And there are other people that are saying, no, Jews need to act in a certain moral way. And usually that translates into the people who are concerned about well-being might be in service, support a military defense, and people who are concerned about the moral vision of the Jews are concerned about how Jews wield power. What's so interesting is that that's happening in this moment, and what's happening is people who are concerned with safety are saying maybe the way we're wielding power is going to impact my safety. And some people who are concerned with safety are saying that's the most moral thing, saving my baby over someone else's baby is the most moral act. So to be inside that conflict, that psychic conflict of the Jewish people has been weighing on me, and it feels important to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you, Rabbi. Yes, it's, in times of conflict, we often look for sides, we look for alignment, we look for, who's against us, who's for us, who am I for, who am I against, right? So this idea of being this community that are people who maybe inherited Judaism or maybe chose to come into Judaism, and then all of the dynamics within that become more evident than typically, right? And so I have a question. I'll pass it to Dr. Dietra Reiser, which is, for yourself, since October 7th, what have you noticed about how conflict is showing up in your work or in workplaces, and in the community, right? And how would you characterize the biggest challenges you're seeing?
So, like many of you, I work both inside the Jewish community and outside the Jewish community, and with a lot of nonprofits and synagogues. And one thing I've noticed, and actually taken a few calls in the last few days around, are what's happening with people who are holding identities that are disadvantaged. And I will first say that with all identities, people are all along the continuum on how they're feeling and where they are standing and how they're standing, right? Some folks are standing in the nuance while others are really being more polarized. And I've heard from two people where there's been a lot of conflict around saying Black Lives Matter again. So, kind of going back to the conversation that we had, feels like many, many years ago when the Black Lives Matter movement started. And what that's symbolizing is really a fracturing, again, that I talked to at the beginning, where often our community is saying, okay, some in Black Lives Matter has made this statement, and so we want to pull away. And then people who are holding identities, and again, not everyone, but people who have ideologies that are that really are saying it's a simple phrase. Black Lives Matter. We've been working towards racial equity in the Jewish community for a long time, and taking signs down and really going towards this polarizing camps erases part of who folks are who have been working towards really making racial equity a part of our community. And so and what people are also saying is those decisions are making them feel isolated. And I think a lot of us are feeling isolated. We're not quite sure who we align with. We're not sure what we can say, how we can show up. This feeling of walking on eggshells that people of all identities have talked to me about. And that makes showing up to work more difficult, because we know that when you feel like you can bring your whole self and there's a sense of belonging, we do better work, and we're able to lean into, I keep saying it, lean into relationship and be part of a community. And so that's, I think the biggest challenge right now is people really feeling isolated and fractured, and these fault lines coming up. When we have a lot to do, both in this conflict and in all these things we've been working on as a community for many years.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. And this is a time for us to lean into our values and not walk away from them because we feel nervous, anxious, afraid, or whatever the feels might be. And a lot of work has been done, and we don't want to just throw that work out because we're in a new moment. We want to figure out how we can bring it along with us. So thank you for saying that. Meredith, we'd love to hear from you, since October 7th. What have you noticed about how conflict is showing up in your work or in workplaces, and how would you characterize the biggest challenge?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Dieter just shared, right? So I think about folks who are drawn to mission-driven work. We're people who are here for a reason, right? We're here to do the hard work, to show up, to make the world better in some form or fashion. And I think we've oftentimes been able to feel in relationship and in alliance with those around the work. And, you know, I oftentimes think like, we don't just have jobs, right? We're like in relationship with the work that we do. And what I am seeing so much of is like being in relationship with someone where you've like suddenly discovered some parts of them that you maybe haven't discovered before, and you're not sure how you feel about it, or even if you like it. And so all of a sudden, some things that are showing up, right? That those differences and clashes of values, of things that you hold tightly to, of sort of ways of showing up and engaging, all of a sudden, it doesn't feel like a place where maybe before I felt safe, maybe I didn't actually feel entirely safe. Now I don't feel safe, or I'm questioning the safety that I had. Can I say this? What are people, you know, what this, that, you know, I thought we had this in common and now I don't. And even that just sort of emotional shift, that experience of someone and something as different than maybe what you thought, the sort of fracturing of some of those alliances. I thought we were on the same side in this, and now I have real questions, can be, that's very complex. And it takes some kind of emotional resolution, I think, to be able to stay in relationship, to actually show up with some curiosity and some grace and some, and it's profoundly hard to do that when you feel disappointed, when you feel disrespected, when you feel unsafe, when you feel, you know, questioning all kinds of things around you, et cetera. So I'm really just seeing so much of like, I don't know if I can show up as my best self. I'm not sure what that would even mean and look like. I'm not sure if I can show up, full stop. And that's really hard.
Yeah, and also we were already or are already figuring out how to navigate cancel culture being a part of culture, right? So it's like it's not a new thing anymore. And that's a big reality. So I appreciate, you know, what you're sharing there. And maybe since we still have you off mute, if you could give some like maybe more tactile, like how can you manage friction between personal individual positions and organizational perspectives, right? Like what are some things that, you know, that people can do when they're seeing disagreement?
Well, I think there's a series of things that I think about as at least a starting place. So first and foremost, I think about just sort of a deep breath and a pause, and then asking myself of like, what matters to me and what do I need in this moment, right? Number one, you know, do I feel safe? And if not, why not? And what's that about, right? And I think even how we show up, like, you know, I'm just thinking about the fact that even I just said something about like being curious, and I think about like power dynamics, and you know, it's easier to show up with curiosity and to try to understand someone's perspective if you're starting from a place of like safety in that relationship. But if you didn't feel it before, and especially if it's coming in a situation where someone has real power in a relationship, then that's not only extraordinarily hard for most people, sometimes it doesn't feel possible, right? Sometimes it may actually feel impossible. And so I think about sort of first and foremost, like, where am I, how am I, and how do I take care of myself in this moment? What do I need? And some or a lot of that, I think, comes back to what's within my locus of control. Some things aren't, but oftentimes a lot is. And oftentimes we crave real agency in a moment when it feels like a lot is outside our locus of control. So how can I pause and sort of ask myself, what do I need? And then what are the things here that I can do to prevent this situation, prepare for this situation, make sure that I show up in a way that I'm responding rather than reacting if something is happening. And recognizing that, you know, I oftentimes use the analogy of like ships out at sea. Like each of us is the captain of some ship. I don't know whether you're on like a cruise ship that feels like it can take on whatever, if you feel like you're on a life raft, right? But each of us is the captain of some version of a ship. We don't have agency or control over the weather. We don't control how big the waves are. But we can sort of ask ourselves, like, if this raft feels like it's got holes in it, can I make sure I got duct tape on board, right? What do I have some granola bars for just in case? Like, what are the things that you actually need to do to care for yourself, and starting to ground yourself in that place so that you can start to think about how to navigate what's going on for you in the particular context in which you exist. That's where I would start.
Thank you. And speaking of having duct tape or glue or another paddle boat, or even, I mean, I personally would like to be on the cruise, but for Dr. Karen, right, just for what I see in my own work, is missing in companies and organizations, or people make a lot of assumptions, right? And they don't assume best intent necessarily. People come in with their own stuff, right? They're on their own boat, to use that analogy. And so I'm just curious, from your perspective, how could we actually create cultures of curiosity and trust in a workplace?
Perfect. Thank you. So first of all, I want to build on what Meredith said, which I think is that it's hard to build these things in the midst of a crisis. But in a certain way, I think part of what I hope for is to trust the relationships and the curiosity that existed before the crisis. I think in a moment of polarization, we're often thinking about what are the headlines. And I think we've seen a lot of litmus tests, right? Which side are you on? Selecting a side, holding on to that side, grasping, trying to, ascertain whose side the other person in front of you is on. And I think that actually destroys a culture of curiosity. And it's not to say that there aren't boundaries and there aren't sides and there aren't perspectives, but I think this conflict, like, the conflict over time, is one that holds layers of complexity and layers of meaning and many different kinds of ships. And for me, the start is to ask questions that are really for understanding and for curiosity and for challenging, testing assumptions, but not for the purpose of challenging them, but for better understanding. And that's really hard, I think, in this moment. But I was thinking a lot about Josh's point around values, right? I think often we do share values, and perhaps we both share a value of security, but maybe it expresses itself in very different ways. And asking the question of, like, what does security mean to you? Or how do your moral dilemmas are not between morality and immorality, but actually about different ways that different morals come into tension with each other, or sometimes even the same moral can be expressed differently in society. Those for me are questions of curiosity. And it forces us not to ask, like, what do you think about this particular policy, say, but let's come from a different place, which is like, how do you understand this? Or why are you advocating for this position? And really leaning into understanding and sitting with discomfort. And it may seem that curiosity and discomfort shouldn't go together, but for me, they do. And they do because when I'm really curious, I have to be open to an answer that may be so different or outside of what my worldview is or my understanding, and yet I'm still seeking to understand it. And I think in that environment, there's an opportunity for growth. But I also think that that can't be created only in the midst of crisis, right? And so I think that actually a culture of curiosity, which is in some ways, unravels some of the power dynamics and allows questions to come from anywhere around almost anything, is something that is so healthy in a workplace. And it really does lead to a learning organization in everything from small management decisions to big political conversations. But when you've built up that trust and when you've invested in that and created that kind of environment, it helps us navigate these moments, right? It allows for really, it doesn't mean that every question is easy. In fact, most of them are quite difficult, but to me, that's where we can see the values come into tension, but we don't have to resolve them. And I think maybe that's the last thing I'll say, which is that I think when I started out in graduate school, it was all around conflict resolution. And like Josh, I've done a lot of work in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And then it sort of went towards conflict management, the title of this workshop. And I went into conflict education in part because, like, sometimes it's actually the ability to sit in the conflict, to hold its layers. There's a great episode in Seinfeld where he makes a reservation and they don't take the reservation, they don't hold the reservation. He says, anyone can take a reservation, but can you hold a reservation? I feel that's true about values and multiple narratives. It's like anyone can say multiple narratives, but can you hold multiple narratives? Can you hold multiple truth? Can you sit with discomfort? That's, to me, the challenge of this space, but that's what enables us to grow and to see and to listen more empathically towards others, not to resolve. right? Not necessarily to move from our positions, but to be open to a wider stance.
Gamal, can I jump in? And
I was gonna say, please, Rabbi, to jump in
so,
there.
I'm struck by how difficult what Karen is sort of pointing out, and some of what I think also Meredith and Dieter are bringing to the fore, how difficult that is right now. My colleague Masua Sagiv, who's I will, as a plug, is the co-host, my co-host on this podcast that we have called Perfect Jewish Parents. And one of the things she said in one of our early episodes, like right after the war, it was like very therapeutic to be able to talk about it. She's like, I've spent the entire last year fighting against the Israeli government. My entire career is built on nuance, and I don't have any room for that right now. And one of the things that I'm struck by is that culture of curiosity and the recognition that the layers of what I like what Encounter, which is a program, Israel programs, calls it the Israeli-Palestinian reality. Like that, it's really hard to recognize complexity and to have curiosity when some of our boundaries might be tighter than they were before. So some of us, and also this is an elastic problem. And what I mean by that is I had no patience on October 12th for people calling for ceasefire. I'm happy to, and I live in Berkeley, California. So I think people were calling for ceasefire on October 7th here. That felt like that's not a complex problem. I find that position immoral, and I had no patience. It was really hard for me to like even be in conversation with my loved ones who might have been one notch to the left of me. And at the same time, on February 12th, when huge populations in Israel are now advocating for what I think a better term is a negotiated settlement than a ceasefire, because it's about bringing hostages home, it's much easier to have that conversation. But in light of, I think what Meredith pointed out, in light of the lack of agency, which let's all recognize, none of us have agency in this moment. Some of us find agency in petitions, and some of us find signing a petition actually the absence of agency. Like it might have meant something when you actually had to go around and collect signatures, but today in the digital age, I don't find them to be particularly meaningful reflections of anything other than, you know, mollifying my own frustrations or lack of agency. But we're living with, like, how do we live with a lack of agency in a moment of an elastic change around what feels legitimate to call for and what feels politically maybe illegitimate? And these are not, the political and the cognitive are not, they're not living in a theoretical world. They're actually deeply rooted in our emotional feelings, right? So like, I want to be sensitive. Like some of us are feeling at the end of our rope, either to the right or to the left or whatever with our organization. And at some point it might be, oh, you've reached the boundary. Like this isn't the right organization for you. But I hope that people can temper sort of their need for agency in this moment, recognize they don't have agency fully, meaning no one's waiting for their call in Doha or in Riyadh or Jerusalem. And that we have to recognize like there's deep pain and sadness and betrayal and anger on all the different sides. And like, how do we sort of work through that is not easy.
Yes, and I want to build on what both of you just shared, is that it's workplace, right? So we're at work. We're there to take action. We're there to be productive. We're there to build something, to have impact, right? And as most of you have shared, or all of you, that the lines between personal and professional, I would, from my perspective, even just from COVID to now, right, have become so mixed. And maybe even confusing for some, right? And it depends on how cognizant you are of those blurred lines. And so I'm just curious, within that and within a place that is work and which is a system, right? And there are power structures there. Within those power structures, there are people who have more agency than others. And so, Meredith, I'd love for you to just share first, how can we account for people in our sector who feel marginalized, either because of their identity or because of generational differences, because maybe just thinking about boundaries in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you asked that question, because one of the things I think about too is just the diversity of this sector, right? I think not just diversity of mission and work that we do, but I think that it's like a good third of people who work in Jewish nonprofits who do not identify as Jewish. And so, and you know, and think about like the various identities that people hold and the intersectionality of those identities and what we are experiencing, how we are experiencing, how proximate it feels or not, really runs the gamut, right? And we've probably all experienced this too, where like, you know, we may go through ups and downs on an hourly, daily, weekly, monthly basis too, based on whatever headline we saw or email we just got, or something that a colleague did or didn't do that, you know, landed on us in a particular way. And so I think there is such a broad range of experiences that we have to hold. And in many ways, I go back actually to a lot of what Karen was just talking about, which is like, we live in a world and a culture that has a tendency to push us into binaries. Something is right and something is wrong. Left, right, up, down, like, you know, pick a side. And I think that is not only not helpful, but actually unhelpful in a moment like this. And the more that we can recognize that many things can be true, many things can be true alongside each other. We can agree on this, we can disagree on that, we can show up in this way and in that way, right? The more we can open ourselves to understanding how many things might be true for us as individuals and where we fit in an organization, how we identify all the identities that we hold, and the more that we can do that with others, the more likely we are to be able to show up in a way that allows us to move forward with the work, as you said. Yeah, I'll pause there.
Thank you. Yes. And Dr. Dietra Reiser, I'd love to hear your response to this as well. And I'll just say, you know, as a Black, Jewish, gay man working, you know, I'm thinking about when I worked at a Jewish organization and just navigating those times. And that was before, well, that was years ago, you know, 4 years ago or so. And so, you know, I think just bringing whatever, you know, as a woman of color, Jewish woman, right? Like, which wherever you would want to speak from, what would you say to your response to this question?
Quickly, tell me exactly what the question was again.
No problem. Yes. So it's really just, how do we account for people in the sector who feel marginalized?
Yeah.
Maybe it's because of their identity or generational differences, or, you know, just thinking about their ability to navigate boundaries differently.
Yeah.
Right.
So my first thing is organizations that have something to reach back to. Really what Karen was saying, it's easier for them because they've had this culture of curiosity. They've done work. Actually, when we were talking before our time today, a lot of characteristics came up with the white dominant culture. And we've kind of talked about some of them here today. So this one right way, both and. So there's all these different characteristics that organizations have and maybe have worked to solve. And the ones who have done that already are able to lean into that work. And they have a culture hopefully they're saying, yes, we're putting relationship first, and really coming from this direction of curiosity and recognizing that no one can know for sure what will work and won't work for policy. And so what can we do, going back to that locus of control? What's getting in our way of being able to continue to have healthy relationships? And I'm not saying that we want to try to have a healthy relationship with someone who is, calling for the demise or death of people, of the Jewish people or people. I'm not saying that, but what I am saying is that in order for us to continue in these relationships when we're not going to be always totally aligned, it's really saying, what do we have in common? Where are the shared values? And I guarantee that if you have a relationship with someone, you already have shared values. And so while there might be some questions around how those shared values are, or maybe not even the shared values, but around what's happening in this moment, or even another conflict, to be able to either talk through some of those things with curiosity, understanding that when I approach these conversations, I'm thinking I don't have all the answers, and the answers I think I have might not even be the answers. And so when I'm allowing myself space for that curiosity, it helps a lot. And I also know that it's hard as a Black Jewish woman who is doing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work that I really identify with personally as a way to make our Jewish community and really our society a stronger society. It is hard right now when folks are all over the place in agreeing or thinking that this is a way forward, where it, while again, folks are all over the map with any identity, but it just feels a little more lonely right now. And so also really thinking, well, where are the relationships that I can lean into more, and which relationships might I just need to kind of have different boundaries, like maybe not talk about this, but really focus more on a shared value has been important for me right now. Oops.
Thank you. And I think, there's many nuggets that all of you have shared. And one thing that you just said that struck me was that when we're in relation with other people, we already have some form of shared values, right? Like when we have a friendship or we feel we have a partnership, there's a connection there. There's something about, there's a sharedness, right? And so we don't want to lose that. We want to really build on that, or at least maintain it. And Dr. Karen, I'd love to, hear from you. How can we be mindful about our personal and professional responses in order to establish a model that allows for conversation, for discourse within the community, and even more specifically within workplace? So how can we help keep that balance in the workplace where we can have dialogue and also be productive in our work?
Perfect. So I want to build on something that Deidre just mentioned, because there are two poems that I often think of poetry as like grounding me. And I have found myself in the months since October 7th oscillating between two of Yehuda Amichai's poems. One is a poem entitled The Diameter of the Bomb, which is about the concentric circles that, when a bomb goes off, all of the ripples of that impact, and feeling myself sort of in that concentric circle. And the other one is a poem entitled The Place Where We Are Right, which Amichai invites us to sort of dig under our own assumptions, not so much in finding what's wrong, but allowing loves and doubts to be what guides our inquiry. And I think for me, that's been the space. And I think one thing that I would say is that like not every relationship is ripe for these kinds of conversations, and not every moment is ripe for those conversations. And even though my professional work is in the area of conflict education around the conflict, there are moments when, you know, I would come home and my kids would ask me questions and I was like, could we just talk about football? Like right now, I'm just not there. And I think one is to just know where you are yourself, and are you in a space where you can engage the hard things? But I think on the other side is also coming back, and I know we've said culture of curiosity a lot, but I think for me, um, I think that I try to open myself up to having these conversations because I know there are a few spaces in which we can have them, but they are built on trust. And it's also trusting that the person in front of you is in the same sort of space of wanting to have that open conversation. And I think that that's something that really guides my work, which is to say, again, there are moments when I'm not there, and even moments when I'm there, but that I need to sort of understand how we can have this conversation in a constructive way. And I think in all of it, I do think that, you know, Josh's points around boundaries and those boundaries feeling, you know, particularly constrained now is true. And I want to honor that feeling and validate the feelings because I know I have felt that too. And yet I have felt still that most of the conversations that I've had that have come from a space of true seeking to understand don't actually bounce up against those boundaries. They're actually far away from those boundaries, even when there are words that trigger me and make me assume that that's where that person is. And so for me, it's a question of saying, tell me more about what you're, you know, I often, my staff will joke that my catchphrase is say more. But it is, say more is sort of a statement, a question buried in a statement. But the idea is like, tell me more about where you are, what you're thinking about, what are the things that are motivating your position. Then I find that we're actually maybe not as close to that boundary as I might have thought at the beginning. And the more that we can open that space, I think the more it allows for us to have those conversations in professional settings. And on the flip side is also to know that like sometimes we need to deal with other things and it's not the moment. And I think both of those things can be true at the same time. But I think in our leadership roles, and especially in Jewish institutions, um, I personally feel a responsibility to creating that space because I think we are lonely in this moment and we have very few spaces where we can process. And inside, it feels sometimes worse than outside in the sense that, like, once we get it out, once we're in conversation, once we actually have the hard conversation, it doesn't mean that it's easy, but maybe it's not as hard as we thought. And that I think opens up new spaces.
Right. And thank you so much. And, you know, again, just thinking about this mercurial workplace culture that we've evolved into, especially because we are mission driven and there's a cultural identity that's often, not all the times, but often shared or at least, you know, appreciated. Rabbi Joshua, I'd love to hear from you. What can we do to move beyond assumptions that we make
Yeah.
about other people?
Yeah.
And
So
then,
I
yeah.
sorry, go. I'll offer. This is something that's a framework that has been helpful, and then one of the things that I've done with it. So Daniil Hartman, who's the president of the Hartman Institute, wrote a book called The Boundaries of Judaism. Speaking of boundaries, Karen, and in the first chapter, he offers sort of a framework for thinking about like, oh, if Judaism is naturally pluralistic, there are things in our community that are like, oh, this is pluralism, meaning I may do something different from Meredith, but the way she does something or thinks about something I see as within the scope of my world. The second sort of framework is tolerance, which is, I don't really like this thing, but I tolerate it existing within my experience. And then he says, and then the third is deviance. But then, of course, he does a nice thing, which is he separates between tolerable deviance and intolerable deviance. And the great example is if I'm driving down the street speeding and I get pulled over, I get a ticket. I'm told you can't do that. And then what do? I get back in the car and I drive away. And he says that's tolerable deviance versus intolerable deviance is, oh, how many people like, oh, you got a DUI and then they take your license away because you were driving under the influence. And then that's like intolerable deviance. We're taking it away from driving. So one goal might be to say, oh, being able to draw that type of distinction actually requires a bunch of like examples. So one of the things I've done, I've been teaching a lot of Hillel professionals, heads of Hillels, and also the variety of professionals in a Hillel space. And one of the things we've done is we've like as we've learned some of that material is like, oh, just as on a card, I'm going to write out something I heard or said, like something someone said to me or something I saw done, and I'm not going to tell anyone else in the group whether that is an experience of pluralism, tolerance, and deviance. I'm just going to write the like thing on the card. And then we've sort of spent time using the framework to flesh out, oh, like, is this something that fits into my personal worldview as tolerance? What about me as a representative of a particular institution? And I'm going to say there's a third, which is what about the institution itself? And I think that being able to sort of flesh out, one of the things that does is it actually helps us distinguish between the ideology that someone might be expressing and the activity, which are often different. And I'm thinking about going back to the example of which has been, there was an article in the Forward last week about like, oh, professionals in Jewish institutions who wanted to sign a letter against a ceasefire or for a ceasefire, and then like, should they put their institution's name or not, and when they were being asked, and the entire framing was about ideology, and it missed the fact that it might like, oh, what is the difference between having a belief system and then signing something with your organization name? It has actually nothing to do with this particular issue. My institution would say, we don't sign things with your name as like a representative of an institution in any setting, right? So what does it mean to be able to tease out when something is ideological, when something is a behavior and where does it fit? My sense is we actually have a lot more things that are tolerable deviance that we can handle, especially as to Dietrich's point, when we're in a relationship, and but that there are certain activities that sort of illuminate for us, oh, that feels really beyond the pale for me. And being able to sort of develop that language feels important.
Thank you. And so we're getting a lot of questions coming in, and one of them is, and we're going to do this in like a speed round for each of you, and we'll start with Meredith. What is one thing an individual can do to manage the interpersonal conflicts they are encountering? So like, what is a tangible action or thought process that people could do to manage the interpersonal conflicts that they are encountering?
Great question. Okay, so I think about a couple of things side by side. I think about first sort of acknowledging what's happening for you emotionally and otherwise, right? All feelings are valid, but sitting with them so that you can figure out what you can do about it. I think a second thing I would add here, just because the word has come up both in the chat and in our conversation, although we're using it in different ways, is just really thinking about boundaries and making sure that we understand what boundaries are. Fundamentally, a boundary is something that you establish that doesn't require other people to do anything. So on a very concrete, right? Like it is not setting a boundary to say, don't email me after 5 p.m. because people will do whatever they're going to do. It is a boundary to say after 5 p.m. I don't look at my email. Okay. So really thinking about, to the extent we're talking about boundaries, and obviously that's a very like micro tangible example, but really thinking about if and when you need to set those, how do you set a boundary that actually truly means you can hold it without requiring that other people do anything different?
Great, thank you. Dr. Dietrich Reiser.
We manage interpersonal conflicts better when we're in a better state. And so I really encourage people to take care of your mental health, which includes setting your own boundaries. It includes not consuming so much media that you are really being traumatized. And so really cutting back on the media that you're watching and getting into nature, doing, your mental break work. And we really do, as people, need to be in relationships. So finding those people that you enjoy spending time with and spending time. And if that means that you say, hey, we need a ground rule of not talking about this conflict, then make that a ground rule.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Karen.
So I think once we've taken care of ourselves, I guess my suggestion would be to ask more questions, but with generosity and curiosity, and to trust those relationships and give the benefit of the doubt in all those interactions, even or perhaps especially when it feels really hard.
Great. And Rabbi, please.
I guess just to add, I would want to ask myself, is this a personality issue? Is it a professional conflict, meaning they don't do their job right? Or is it an ideological conflict? And being able to sort of clarify for myself a little bit about where my conflict is, and then to say, okay, how much of this can I tolerate? How much does this feel like it's inside our organizational world view? How much of this is actually it's intolerable deviance and I can't live with it? Those set of questions are questions that I've been asking myself and trying to be very Talmudic, so to speak, in my reasoning around being really tight on the details of how that works.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for all that you've shared. Thank you for all the panelists. And I'm going to invite the JPro team to come in and close us out. This was really powerful conversation, and we hope to be able to have more of it.
Thank you so much, Gamal, and all of our panelists. We really, really appreciate all of your wisdom that you've shared today. I'm sure there's so much more that we could have gotten into, but we really appreciate everything that you covered, and in particular, the practical elements at the end of our conversation to really make sure that people have tangible takeaways. Thank you so much for all of your wisdom and insight. One of the things that we recognize also at JPro is that learning from the wisdom of the tradition and what we have come up with in dealing with trauma in other situations can be very helpful as well. So one of the resources that we'll be sending after this session is some resources from the Berman Archive that address this topic as well through some other angles. And hopefully that will be helpful to folks as well. In addition to that, as you may have seen, JPro recently announced a new affinity group for middle managers specifically who are navigating conflict within workplaces, and that and all of the other affinity groups that JPro offers and our other programming can be found on the JPro website if you'd like to register for sessions. In conclusion, I would just say that JPro is always really interested in hearing from everyone in the field about how we can continue to support you, how we can continue this conversation and all of the others that are so important in this moment. You can drop us a note in the chat before you leave today. You can reach out to me via email, or you can also put your notes about things that would be helpful in the evaluation for today's session, which my colleague Joe is putting into the chat. I just want to thank again, Gamal, Deetra, Meredith, Josh, Karen. It's just been such a pleasure being with all of you here today. Thank you for everyone for joining us, and we'll hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.